The city of Fayetteville, Arkansas is nearly 200 years old. Over that time, a lot of history is built up. Let's take a short tour of town and see where some of that history is. The first stop on our tour is Evergreen Cemetery. Evergreen Cemetery was originally the private cemetery of John Thomas and his family. Thomas died down in Texas, but his wife Harriet is buried here on the original family land. Local Masons bought the property around 1870 to give Fayetteville a city cemetery. They sold it to the Evergreen Association, which still operates and maintains a cemetery today, in 1915. A good place to start looking for history inside Evergreen is with the graves of W.S. Campbell and Walter J. Lemke. Mr. Campbell's book, 100 Years of Fayetteville, 1828 to 1928, is absolutely essential reading for anyone interested in our city's history. Professor Lemke's contribution to local history through the Washington County Historical Society and his flashback journal is invaluable and cannot be overstated. Of course, Evergreen has its towering monuments to such notables as Archibald Yell, Lafayette Gregg, Peter Van Winkle, Sophia Sawyer, and others. But, interestingly, the gravestones of two of our most internationally renowned citizens, architect Edward Durrell Stone and Senator J.W. Fulbright, are extremely modest by comparison. Clearly, there are many well-known people buried in Evergreen, but sometimes the stories of the lesser-known are just as interesting. For example, A.C. McAdams was an early druggist in Fayetteville. He hired Fred Schuler to run a new store on Dixon Street. Fred became so popular with University of Arkansas students that the area near the corner of West and Dixon Street became known as Schulertown. In the northeast corner of the cemetery are the headstones of Charles and Jack Tidball, brothers who died within 8 days of one another during World War I. The Latin inscriptions at the bottom of the stone indicate that Charles, who died of influenza on a Navy ship, is buried here. Jack, however, was killed in action and is buried in an American military cemetery in France. Frank Barr owned the first permanent movie theater in town, the Lyric. He was also a band conductor, and his kids' band performed all over town back in the 19-teens and 20s. This newer bench honors local singer-songwriter Nick Masulo. Nick died of MS in 2008 and was an inspiration to all who knew him. To end our Evergreen tour on a more upbeat note, here's the gravestone of boxer Thomas Trigger Holt. The words on the stone are hard to read, but under Holt's name it says, "Just one of the boys." On the left, the boxing gloves, Southwest Greatest Bantamweight, 1920-1925. On the right, a friend to everyone. And on the bottom, the great referee's decision, victory. Trigger Holt must have been a really fine fellow. The stretch of College Avenue from the Ozark Theater down to the old jail is one of the last intact areas of old Fayetteville. The Ozark, originally called the Knights of Pythias Theater after the group that built it in 1904-1905, was the upscale theater in Fayetteville, especially during the 1940s and 1950s. The old courthouse was also built in 1904-1905. Still in use as a courthouse today, it also houses the Washington County Archives. The building just south of the old courthouse with the yellow brick facade was originally built as a National Guard armory in 1929. In the 1950s, it was used as the Fayetteville Boys Club. Next to the historic Armory building is the Legion Hut, built in 1940. Back in those days, Bob Wills frequently played in the hut, and in the 1950s, barbershop quartets often performed there. The old jail, with its medieval look, was built in 1897. The last hanging in Washington County, the next to last hanging in the state of Arkansas, took place on the north side of the old jail in 1913. If you go around behind the old jail and the Legion Hut, you will discover a squat, uninviting building, which is an even older jail, built around 1885. Just off the square on Center Street is a plaque where a Methodist church once stood. There was an even earlier Methodist church closer to the corner of Church and Center. These two old churches are why Church Street has its name. In the mid to late 1930s, overpasses were built over the railroad tracks at both Lafayette and Maple Streets. Plaques at both ends of the overpasses tell the year in which they were completed. Railroad service came to Fayetteville in 1881. The depot built for that service has survived several renovations over the years. Across Dixon Street from the depot is a plaque that explains how the University of Arkansas sports teams went from being the Cardinals to the Razorbacks. In 1951, as part of their patriotic crusade to strengthen liberty campaign, the Boy Scouts of America had a replica of the Statue of Liberty placed near the Washington County Hospital on North Street. When the hospital moved out near the Northwest Arkansas Mall, the statue and its explanatory plaque went with it. Will Rogers came to Fayetteville in 1927 and 1931. Part of the proceeds from the 1931 benefit show went towards maintaining Arkansas Avenue. Grateful locals placed this monument and plaque in Rogers' honor. Next on our tour are some old buildings on or near the square. In the 1800s, a series of county courthouses occupied the center of the square. In 1911, a new post office was built on this site. It was Fayetteville's main post office until 1963, when it was replaced by a new one down on Dixon Street. The Eason Building, named after a prominent family specializing in insurance and real estate, dates back to 1889 and once housed an earlier version of the Bank of Fayetteville. The Eason Building was remodeled in the early 1990s. Across from the Eason Building is the present-day incarnation of the Bank of Fayetteville. This interesting old building was the home of Lewis Brothers Hardware for much of the 20th century. Next door is the Mrs. Young Building, constructed in 1887. Mrs. Young came to Fayetteville with her husband, who either died or left her. She became a successful photographer on her own and ran a studio in town for many years. The old Washington Hotel, built in 1905, occupied the southwest corner of the square for decades. The current building very much resembles the old hotel, but it has only one story and a cupola, whereas the Washington had 3 stories. This building on the southeast corner of the square dates back to 1886. In the mid-1920s, Geisinger Music moved from across the square to this location, and still today it is known as the Geisinger Building. A local law firm is currently located here. Entrepreneur A.F. Wolf had this building constructed in 1907. In the 1950s, the third floor was a Masonic hall, and the city library was on the second floor. Today, the Wolf Building houses our city administration offices. Sophia Sawyer's Fayetteville Seminary opened near the square in 1839. Not long after, it was relocated to West Mountain Street between Locust and School Avenues. In the 1950s, the blue house in the picture was the office of Dr. William Fowler, one of Fayetteville's finest physicians of that time. Well, that's the end of our tour for now, and we've barely scratched the surface of local history. There's lots more of old Fayetteville to see out there. Here's hoping you may enjoy finding it.